I signed everything over to them without asking a single question. That was the part my son kept repeating later, as if he still couldn't believe how easy it had been, as if my silence meant I hadn't understood what I was doing. But I understood perfectly, every word, every clause, every carefully crafted sentence designed to make me disappear from the life I had spent 42 years building. And I remember the exact moment I decided to let them have exactly what they wanted, because it wasn't at the lawyer's office, and it wasn't even when the papers were placed in front of me. It was 2 nights earlier, at a dinner that was supposed to feel like family, but tasted like something rehearsed, something measured, something cold beneath the warm lighting and the polished oak table that still held the faint scratches from when Daniel was a boy doing his homework while I cooked in the kitchen, and Clara sat across from me that night with her hands folded neatly, her smile too precise, too practiced, as if she had already decided how the evening would go before I ever walked into the room. And Daniel, my only son, couldn't quite meet my eyes, which told me more than anything she said, because he used to look at me like I was the center of his world, and now he looked at me like I was something temporary, something that needed to be handled, and I listened as they talked about practical arrangements, and making things easier, and ensuring stability moving forward. Words that sounded kind if you didn't listen too closely, words that wrapped something sharp in something soft. And then Clara said it, so casually she might as well have been commenting on the weather. "You won't be needing all this anyway, Margaret." And there it was, the truth laid out in a single sentence, not shouted, not forced, just placed gently on the table like it belonged there, like I was supposed to agree with it, like my life had already been reduced to something smaller in their minds, something manageable, something they could divide and distribute as they saw fit. And I remember nodding slowly, not because I agreed, but because I needed them to believe that I did, because in that moment I realized something they hadn't, something my late husband had made sure of long before any of this began. And I went to bed that night in the same room where I had slept beside him for decades, the house quiet in a way that still felt unfamiliar without his presence. And I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying every word, every glance, every silence that had stretched just a little too long. And by morning I had already decided what I would do, not out of anger, not even out of hurt, but out of clarity, the kind that comes when you finally see people exactly as they are. And so when we sat in that lawyer's office 2 days later, when Mr. Cole adjusted his glasses and slid the documents toward me with that careful, professional tone, when Daniel shifted in his seat and Clara watched me like she was waiting for resistance that never came, I picked up the pen without hesitation, my hand steady, my expression calm, and I signed every page exactly where they told me to, because I wasn't giving anything away, not really, I was simply allowing them to step into a story they thought they understood, a story where they believed they had already won, and I let them believe it. Because sometimes the most powerful move you can make is to give people exactly what they ask for, and then wait for them to realize what it actually costs. The house felt different the morning after I signed those papers, not emptier, not quieter, just observed, as if every object had suddenly become part of an inventory I no longer controlled, and I moved through it slowly, the way I used to when Daniel was a child, and I did not want to wake him from his afternoon naps. Except now there was no one sleeping, no one to protect. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock above the stove marking time that no longer belonged to me. In their eyes, and I poured myself a cup of coffee the same way I had for years. 2 scoops, a splash of cream. Nothing changed in the motion, but everything had changed in the meaning, because yesterday they had already begun to treat me differently. Not openly, not in a way they could be called out for, but in small shifts that would go unnoticed by anyone who had not lived in this house for over 4 decades. Clara had started referring to rooms as if they were already hers. "We could turn this into an office," she said, standing in the doorway of what used to be Daniel's bedroom. And Daniel nodded like a man approving a renovation rather than acknowledging the place where he once kept his baseball cards and science projects. And I stood there with my coffee, listening, watching, saying nothing, because silence has a way of making people reveal more than questions ever could. And later that afternoon they brought in a real estate agent, a woman named Susan with a bright smile and a clipboard held close to her chest, and she walked through my home as if it were already listed, already priced, already reduced to square footage and market potential, and she asked me polite questions that did not require real answers. How long I had lived here, whether I had made any recent upgrades. And I answered her calmly, because there is a certain dignity in not correcting people when they think they understand your situation. And Clara followed her from room to room, pointing out features, suggesting changes, discussing timelines, all with a confidence that would have impressed me if it had not been so transparent. And Daniel stayed close to her side, occasionally glancing at me, as if checking whether I would object, whether I would suddenly remember that I had a voice in all of this. But I did not give him that. I simply watched. The way I had watched him take his first steps, the way I had watched him leave for college, the way I had watched him walk down the aisle with a woman who smiled just a little too perfectly. And by evening, when the agent had left and the house had settled back into its familiar quiet, Clara poured herself a glass of wine and leaned against the kitchen counter like she belonged there completely. "This is going to be good for everyone," she said, not looking at me, and Daniel echoed her sentiment. With a softer tone, something about making things easier, something about taking care of me, words that sounded like concern but felt like distance, and I nodded again, the same way I had the night before, because agreeing is sometimes the simplest way to keep a situation moving forward exactly where you want it to go. And as I rinsed my cup and set it carefully in the drying rack, I caught my reflection in the window above the sink, a 72-year-old woman with silver hair pulled back neatly, eyes steady, expression unreadable, and for a moment I wondered what they saw when they looked at me, whether they saw someone fragile, someone finished, someone ready to step aside. And I realized it did not matter, because what they saw had already shaped their decisions, and those decisions had already set everything in motion, and the only thing left for me to do was let it unfold exactly as planned. Because sometimes the clearest path to the truth is not to stop people, but to give them space to show you exactly who they are. It was not until the next morning that the call came, not from Daniel, not from Clara, but from someone who had not been part of their careful little performance. And that alone told me it mattered, because people who have nothing to gain are usually the ones who tell the truth. And when I heard the voice on the other end, I recognized it immediately: Thomas Reed, my husband's former financial advisor, a man who had always spoken plainly, even when the truth was inconvenient, and he did not waste time with pleasantries. "Margaret, I heard about the transfer," he said, his tone measured but edged with something I could not quite place, concern perhaps, or disbelief, and I set my coffee down slowly, giving him my full attention, because I knew this was not a casual call, not something he would do out of curiosity. And when I confirmed that yes, everything had been signed, everything had been handed over exactly as requested, there was a pause on the line, the kind that stretches just long enough to carry meaning. "Did they explain the structure to you?" he asked, and I smiled faintly, though he could not see it, because that question told me everything I needed to know about what Daniel and Clara had chosen not to say, and I answered him carefully, not with a lie, but not with the full truth either. They explained what they thought was important. And Thomas exhaled softly, the sound of a man who had seen this situation before, perhaps too many times. "Your husband set things up differently than most people realize," he continued, and I leaned back in my chair, letting his words settle, because I had been waiting for someone to say it out loud, to confirm what I already suspected, that what Daniel and Clara believed they had taken was not what it appeared to be. And Thomas went on to mention documents, provisions, a trust that had layers most people would not notice unless they knew exactly where to look. And as he spoke, I found myself remembering small moments from years ago, my husband sitting at this same kitchen table with stacks of papers, telling me in his quiet way that some things were better understood later, not all at once, because timing, he used to say, was everything. And I had trusted him then, the same way I trusted him now, even in his absence. And when Thomas finished, he did not tell me what to do. He did not offer advice or instructions. He simply said, "Just make sure you know what is actually yours." And I thanked him, my voice steady, before ending the call. And for a long moment I sat there in the quiet, the clock ticking, the sunlight shifting slightly across the floor, and I realized that nothing about the situation had changed. Not really. Daniel and Clara still believed they had secured everything. They were still moving forward with their plans, still measuring rooms, still speaking about timelines and renovations and future arrangements. But now there was something else. Beneath it all, something they could not see, something they had not accounted for. And later that day, When Clara mentioned meeting with another attorney to finalize a few details, I nodded as if it were routine, as if I had no reason to question it, because the truth is, I did not need to question anything anymore. I already had the answer. I just needed to let them arrive at it on their own. And as I stood at the kitchen window that evening, watching the light fade over the backyard where Daniel used to play, I felt a calm settle over me. Not the kind that comes from resolution, but the kind that comes from understanding exactly where things are headed and knowing that you do not have to stop it. You only have to let it happen at the right moment. That night, I did not sleep much, not because I was worried, but because I was remembering. And memory has a way of rearranging itself when you finally understand the present. Small details that once seemed harmless now aligning into something clearer, sharper. And I thought about the past few years, about the way Clara had slowly positioned herself into every decision that once belonged to Daniel and me. How she had taken over conversations about finances with a polite confidence that made it seem like she was helping. How she had started asking questions that sounded innocent, but were always just a little too specific. Questions about account numbers, about property taxes, about how things would be handled someday. And I remembered the first time Daniel hesitated before answering me directly. The way he glanced at her, as if checking for approval. A small moment that meant nothing at the time, but now felt like the beginning of something much larger. And I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet of the house, realizing that I had not been pushed out all at once. It had been gradual, deliberate, almost invisible, like a door closing inch by inch until one day you realize you are standing on the other side of it. And the next morning, Clara was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, scrolling through something on her phone, a list perhaps, a schedule, something organized and efficient. And she greeted me with that same composed smile, asking if I had slept well, as if nothing had changed, as if everything had always been this way. And Daniel joined us a few minutes later, his tone careful, almost rehearsed, explaining that they would need to meet with the attorney again to wrap things up properly. And I listened, nodding at the appropriate moments, because I could see now how everything fit together, how each step they took was part of a plan they believed was airtight. And what struck me most was not their ambition, not even their sense of entitlement, but their certainty, the quiet confidence that comes from thinking you have accounted for every variable, every possibility, every outcome. And I poured myself another cup of coffee, the same measured movements, the same calm expression, because there is no reason to rush when you already know how the story ends. And later that afternoon, I went upstairs to the study, a room Daniel rarely entered anymore, a room that still felt like my husband's in the smallest details, the arrangement of books, the way the desk faced the window, the faint scent of old paper and polished wood. And I opened the drawer he used to keep locked, the one he had shown me only once, years ago, when he told me that some things were meant to be understood when the time was right. And inside were the documents Thomas had mentioned, neatly organized, precisely labeled, nothing left to chance. And as I read through them slowly, carefully, I felt something settle into place. Not surprise, not relief, but recognition, because this was exactly the kind of protection my husband would have put in place. Not obvious, not confrontational, but thorough, layered, and patient. And when I closed the drawer and locked it again, I understood that Daniel and Clara had not discovered something new. They had only uncovered the surface of something much deeper, something they did not yet realize they had stepped into. And when I came back downstairs that evening, Clara was discussing moving timelines again, her voice light, almost excited, and Daniel was agreeing, already imagining the next steps, the next phase, the future they believed was firmly in their control. And I took my seat at the table, listening, watching, saying nothing, because sometimes the most important part of a plan is not what you do, but what you allow others to believe you have already done. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon, and Clara made sure everything about it felt official. As if formality alone could guarantee control, she chose the time, coordinated with the attorney, even suggested what I should wear with a gentle tone that carried more instruction than kindness. And I agreed to everything without hesitation, because agreement had become my most useful tool. And when we arrived at the office, the air inside was cool and quiet, the kind of space designed to make decisions feel permanent. And Mr. Cole greeted us with the same professional courtesy as before, though this time there was something slightly more attentive in his eyes when he looked at me. as if he was measuring something beyond the surface, and we all took our seats, Daniel to my right, Clara across from me, her posture straight, her expression composed, her hands resting neatly on the table like she had already rehearsed this moment, and the documents were placed in front of us again, thicker this time, more detailed, each page carefully prepared, each clause positioned to appear reasonable, beneficial even, if you did not look too closely, and Clara began speaking first, explaining how this final step would streamline everything, how it would protect the family's future, phrases that sounded generous but carried a quiet assumption that I was no longer part of that future in any meaningful way, and Daniel added his voice, softer, more hesitant, but still aligned with hers, reassuring me that this was the best path forward, that it would make things easier for everyone involved, and I listened without interrupting, without questioning, because questions would have only slowed them down, and I had no interest in slowing anything down, and when Mr. Cole began reviewing the documents aloud, his voice steady and precise, I watched Clara's expression closely, the slight tightening at the corners of her eyes when certain clauses were mentioned, the quick glance she gave Daniel when timelines were discussed, small signals that revealed more than her words ever did. And when he paused to ask if there were any concerns, Clara answered before I could speak, confidently, efficiently, as if my silence had already granted her that right, and I allowed it, because sometimes giving someone control is the easiest way to see how they will use it. And then the pen was placed in front of me again, the same pen, the same expectation, the same quiet pressure that filled the room, and I picked it up without hesitation, signing where indicated, page after page, my hand steady, my expression unchanged, while Clara watched with a satisfaction she did not quite manage to hide, and Daniel exhaled softly beside me, as if something heavy had just been lifted, as if the outcome he had been hoping for had finally been secured. And when the final signature was complete, Mr. Cole gathered the documents carefully, aligning the pages with practiced precision, and for a brief moment the room was still, not tense, not uncertain, just paused, as if waiting for something unspoken to settle into place, and Clara leaned back slightly, her posture relaxing for the first time since we arrived, a small but telling shift, the kind that only happens when someone believes the outcome is no longer in question, and Daniel looked at me then, really looked at me, searching perhaps for a reaction he could not quite name, but I gave him nothing more than a calm nod, the same calm I had carried from the beginning, because there was nothing left to say, not yet, and as we stood to leave, Clara thanked the attorney with a bright, confident smile, already speaking about next steps, already moving forward as if everything ahead of her was certain, and I followed them out into the hallway, the sound of our footsteps echoing softly against the polished floor, knowing that everything had indeed been finalized, just not in the way they believed. The drive home was quiet, but it was not the kind of silence that comes from discomfort. It was the kind that settles in when everyone believes a difficult chapter has finally been closed, and Clara filled it with plans almost immediately, talking about contractors, timelines, how quickly they could begin making changes once everything was processed, her voice light and energized, as if she had been holding all of this in and could finally let it out, and Daniel agreed with her in short, affirming responses, occasionally glancing at me in the rearview mirror as if checking whether I was still following along, whether I understood that things were moving forward without me, and I sat in the back seat, looking out the window at familiar streets that now felt slightly removed, not because they had changed, but because my place within them had been quietly reassigned in their minds. And when we pulled into the driveway, Clara stepped out first, already on her phone, already coordinating something, already speaking as if ownership had shifted the moment the ink dried, and Daniel lingered for a second, opening my door, offering his hand in a gesture that felt more like habit than intention, and I accepted it with a small nod, because there was no need to reject something so insignificant when everything else was already in motion, and inside the house the air felt the same as it always had, the same light filtering through the windows, the same quiet hum of appliances, but Clara moved through it differently now, not as a guest, not even as family, but as someone mapping out a future that she believed was entirely hers, and she began pointing things out again. This wall could be opened up, that room could be repurposed, her words quick, confident, uninterrupted, and Daniel followed her, listening, agreeing, already adjusting to the version of events she was laying out, and I stood in the doorway of the living room, watching them the way one watches a scene unfold from a distance, not detached, but no longer involved. And it struck me then how certain they were, how completely convinced they had secured everything, not just the house, not just the accounts, but the narrative itself, the belief that they had been careful, thorough, successful, and I let that certainty settle around them, because it was necessary, because without it, what came next would not carry the same weight. And later that evening, after dinner, Clara mentioned that the final documents would be formally recorded in a few days, that everything would become official once the attorney completed the filing. And Daniel added that there would be a brief follow-up meeting to confirm everything had gone through properly, a final step. He called it something routine, something procedural, and I nodded again. The same calm agreement I had given from the beginning, because routine is often where the most important details are overlooked. And as I rinsed the dishes and set them carefully in the rack, I could hear Clara in the other room, already discussing paint colors, furniture placement, the kind of details that only come into focus when someone believes there are no more obstacles left. And I dried my hands slowly, taking my time, because there was no reason to rush, not anymore. And when I turned off the kitchen light and made my way upstairs, I paused for a moment at the top of the staircase, looking down at the house that had held my entire life. And I realized that nothing had been taken from me. Not really. It had only been reassigned in a way that had yet to reveal its full shape. And as I stepped into my room and closed the door behind me, I felt the same quiet certainty I had carried since the beginning, the understanding that everything was proceeding exactly as it needed to, and that sometimes the most complete control comes not from stopping what is happening, but from allowing it to reach the moment where it can no longer be undone. The days leading up to the final confirmation passed with a kind of quiet efficiency that only comes when people believe there is nothing left to question, and Clara moved through each day with increasing confidence, her voice sharper, her decisions quicker, no longer checking with Daniel as often, no longer softening her tone when she spoke about changes. And it was in those small shifts that everything became clearer, because control, once assumed, rarely hides itself for long, and Daniel seemed to follow her pace without realizing it, adjusting his routines, his priorities, even his language, referring to the house as ours, in a way that felt practiced rather than natural. And I listened each time without correcting him, because correction would have required explanation, and explanation would have revealed too much too soon. And one afternoon, while they were both out meeting with a contractor, I received a call from Mr. Cole's office, a brief message confirming that the documents had been processed and that we were scheduled for a final review the following morning. And I thanked the assistant calmly, writing down the time as if it were any other appointment, because in many ways it was just another step in a process they believed was already complete. And when Daniel and Clara returned later that evening, they were carrying samples, brochures, measurements written in neat lists, speaking in overlapping sentences about possibilities, about how quickly everything could be transformed once the last formality was out of the way. And Clara mentioned the meeting casually, as if it were a simple confirmation, a final box to check before everything officially belonged to them. And Daniel agreed, his tone lighter than it had been in weeks, as if a weight he had not fully acknowledged was finally gone. And I nodded, the same measured response I had given from the beginning, because consistency is often mistaken for acceptance, and that misunderstanding was working exactly as it needed to. And later that night, after the house had settled and their voices had faded behind closed doors, I returned to the study one more time, not to search for anything new, but to review what I already knew, the documents my husband had left, the structure he had built, the provisions that did not reveal themselves until the right moment. And I read through them again slowly, not because I needed to understand them, but because I wanted to feel the certainty of them, the precision, the intention, the quiet foresight that had anticipated exactly this kind of situation without ever naming it directly. And when I finished, I placed everything back exactly as it had been, locking the drawer with the same small, deliberate motion, because nothing needed to be moved. Nothing needed to be changed. Everything was already in place. And the next morning, as I dressed for the meeting, I chose the same kind of simplicity I had worn before, nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would suggest anything beyond quiet agreement. And when we gathered at the front door, Clara was already checking her watch, already ready to move forward, and Daniel gave me a brief, almost relieved smile, as if this final step would bring everything into alignment. And as we walked out together, the air cool and still, I felt that same steady calm settle in once more, not anticipation, not tension, just the quiet understanding that the moment they had been working toward was finally here, and that sometimes the most revealing part of any plan is not when it begins, but when it is about to be confirmed. The office felt colder that morning, or perhaps it was simply quieter, the kind of quiet that settles in just before something shifts, and we took our seats in the same arrangement as before, Daniel beside me, Clara across, her posture composed but more relaxed now, as if this was no longer a negotiation but a confirmation of what she already believed to be hers. And Mr. Cole entered with a thin folder instead of the thicker stack from before, which Clara seemed to take as a good sign. A finality, something simplified, and he greeted us briefly before sitting down, his expression neutral but focused in a way that suggested he was paying closer attention than usual, and he opened the folder carefully, aligning the pages with deliberate precision, and began to speak in that same measured tone, explaining that everything had been processed, that the documents had been reviewed, that the transfer had been executed according to the terms that had been signed, and Clara leaned back, slightly, her shoulders easing, her fingers resting lightly against the table as if she was already settling into the outcome, and Daniel exhaled beside me, a quiet release of tension that he may not have even realized he was holding, and I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, my attention fixed not on Clara or Daniel, but on Mr. Cole, because it was his voice that mattered now, his words, his timing, and he continued, moving through the summary of what had been established, what had been agreed upon, what had been filed, each sentence reinforcing what Clara and Daniel already believed, and then he paused, just briefly, just long enough to shift the rhythm of the room, and Clara straightened slightly, her attention sharpening, as if sensing something she could not yet identify, and Mr. Cole adjusted his glasses, looking down at the final page, and his voice changed just enough to be noticeable, not louder, not slower, but more deliberate, and he said, "There is, however, one provision that must be read in full, as it directly affects the validity of the transfer." And Clara's fingers stilled against the table, Daniel's posture tightened almost imperceptibly, and I remained exactly as I had been, because this was the moment everything had been moving toward, and Mr. Cole began to read, his voice steady, each word clear, each phrase precise, outlining a condition that had been embedded within the structure itself, a condition that did not prevent the transfer, did not challenge it outright, but defined the circumstances under which it could exist. And as he continued, the room seemed to narrow around those words, the air holding still in a way that made even the smallest sound feel distant, and Clara's expression shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but in subtle increments, the confidence giving way to something else, something less certain, and Daniel glanced at her, then back at the document, as if trying to follow along, trying to understand what had just changed, and Mr. Cole reached the final sentence, the one that completed the clause, the one that clarified everything without raising his voice or altering his tone, and when he finished, he did not immediately continue. He simply looked up from the page, his expression composed but unmistakably different now, as if the meaning of what he had just read had settled fully into place, and for a moment no one spoke, not Clara, not Daniel, not even the quiet movements that usually fill a room like this, and in that stillness, the certainty they had carried with them began to unravel, not loudly, not suddenly, but in the quiet realization that something they had overlooked had been there all along. For a long moment after Mr. Cole finished reading, no one spoke, and it was not confusion that filled the room. It was recognition, the slow, undeniable realization that something fundamental had been misunderstood, and Clara was the first to react. Though even her response was restrained, her voice measured but edged with disbelief as she asked him to clarify the provision, to explain exactly what it meant in practical terms, and Mr. Cole did not hesitate. He simply repeated the key condition. In plain language, that the transfer of assets remained valid only under the assumption of voluntary agreement, free of pressure, manipulation, or misrepresentation, and that any evidence suggesting otherwise would immediately nullify the entire arrangement, restoring full control to the original holder. And as he spoke, his tone remained professional. But there was a weight to his words now, a finality that did not invite interpretation, and Daniel shifted beside me, his posture tightening, his gaze moving between Clara and the document, as if searching for something he had missed, something that could still be corrected. And Clara's composure began to fracture in small, controlled ways, her fingers pressing lightly against the edge of the table, her expression sharpening as she asked whether this clause had been disclosed during the signing. And Mr. Cole responded calmly that it had been included in the documentation provided, that all parties had been given the opportunity to review it in full, and that the language itself was standard within the structure that had been established years earlier, long before any recent changes had been proposed. And that was the moment everything settled into place, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with understanding, the kind that does not need to be announced because it is already complete. And I could see it in Daniel's eyes then. The realization that this had not been a simple transfer, not a straightforward reassignment of ownership, but something far more deliberate, something that had accounted for possibilities he had never considered. And Clara's voice grew quieter as she asked, what would constitute evidence of undue influence? Her earlier confidence replaced by careful calculation, and Mr. Cole explained that such determinations were not made in isolation, that patterns of behavior, documented communications, and circumstantial factors could all be considered, and that the clause existed specifically to ensure that the original intent of the estate could not be altered through pressure or strategic omission. And when he finished, the room returned to silence. But it was no longer the same silence as before. It carried a different weight now, one shaped by the understanding that what had seemed certain was no longer fixed. And I sat there as I had from the beginning, my hands still, my expression calm, because there was nothing left to reveal, nothing left to explain. And after a moment, I stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a simple, deliberate movement that drew their attention without demanding it. And I looked at Daniel, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with a clarity that had taken years to arrive. And then I spoke, my voice steady, measured, carrying no more emotion than necessary. I did not stop you, I said quietly. I simply allowed you to show me what you were willing to do. And I let that settle, not as a judgment, not as a lesson, but as a fact. And then I turned toward the door, because there was no reason to stay any longer. The outcome had already been decided the moment they believed it was theirs, and as I stepped out into the hallway, the air felt unchanged, the world outside just as it had been before, but something within it had shifted, something that could not be undone, and I walked forward without hesitation, because sometimes the only thing left to do, once the truth has been made clear, is to leave it exactly where it stands.